The planet Zorvathy was once a beautiful world, teeming with life and prosperity. But now it was a wasteland. Decades of environmental collapse, overexploitation of resources, and devastating wars had destroyed almost everything. The Zorvathy people, a species known for their advanced technology and wisdom, had watched as their planet's life support systems slowly died. Water, the most vital element for their survival, had become a rare and precious resource. Without it, their entire civilization was on the brink of extinction. Zira, a young Zorvathy girl, had been wandering the barren landscape for days, searching for anything to drink. Her once bright skin had turned pale and dry, and her energy had long since faded. She stumbled through the cracked earth, the sun beating down on her fragile body. She had been away from her people for too long, and now she was alone, with only the hope of finding some water left. The Zorvathy were different from humans. Their biology required a unique form of hydration, a liquid that was once abundant on their planet, but now was all but gone. Without it, their cells would dry up, and their bodies would begin to shut down. That's why Xira had been sent on a mission, to find a way to save her people. But now, she wasn't even sure if she could survive long enough to finish it. Her vision blurred as the world around her faded. She had no strength left. Her legs gave out, and she collapsed onto the cracked soil, her mouth dry as dust. She couldn't go on much longer. As Xira lay there, on the edge of death, she heard a noise in the distance, the sound of a low hum, like an engine or a machine. Her heart, weak and slow, beat with a small spark of hope. Someone, something, might be out there. She tried to focus, but her body was failing her. She was too weak to move, too dehydrated to even lift her head. She could only listen, waiting for the sound to grow closer. Then, through her foggy vision, she saw it. A small metal structure appeared on the horizon, moving slowly toward her. It was a human outpost. She could tell by the shape and the technology. The humans had arrived on Zorvathy, hoping to make contact with the last surviving members of the Zorvathy race. They were unaware of the planet's true state. They were here for peace, or so they thought. Xira tried to lift herself up, but her arms trembled and refused to obey. The ground beneath her felt hot, and her vision swam as her body begged for water. She had no idea if the humans would help her or ignore her, but she had no choice but to wait. Her eyes closed for a moment, and for a split second, she thought she might never wake up. When she opened them again, she was no longer lying on the ground. Someone had moved her. A human, a man, was kneeling beside her, looking down at her with concern. He had dark hair and a kind face, though his features were hard to make out through the haze of her dying vision. "Hey, are you okay?" The man asked in a soft, steady voice. His words felt strange to her. She understood them, but they sounded distant, as if she were hearing them underwater. Xira could barely form words, but she managed a soft moan. The man's expression turned to one of understanding. He stood up, and after a moment, returned with a small container in his hands. It was something she had never seen before, a bottle with a liquid inside that seemed to shimmer in the dim light. "I've got something for you," the man said, lifting the bottle to her lips. "It's water. You're going to be okay." Xira's heart skipped. Water. She had to have it. She needed it more than anything, and this could be her only chance to survive. Without thinking, she opened her mouth and drank. The liquid was sweet, thicker than any water she had ever known, but it filled her with a strange sense of relief. For the first time in what felt like forever, she didn't feel so thirsty. At first, it felt like the drink was exactly what she needed, but as the seconds passed, something inside her began to change. The liquid wasn't like anything she had expected. It wasn't water. It was something else, something strange. The man had called it water, but it was different. Her body started to react. At first, it was a small shiver running through her, but soon, she could feel every cell in her body coming alive. Her skin, dry and cracked from the sun, began to feel warmer. She could feel her organs slowly starting to function again, but it wasn't just water doing this. It was as if the liquid was healing her, not just quenching her thirst. She gasped and tried to sit up, but the sensation was overwhelming. Her heart raced, her vision sharpened, and her body seemed to pulse with energy. She felt stronger. It was as though her body had been rejuvenated, and she didn't know why or how. The man, who had been watching her closely, seemed just as confused. He stepped back, unsure of what was happening to her. What are you?" he whispered, his voice filled with astonishment. Zira could only stare back, equally confused. Whatever this liquid was, it wasn't just helping her survive. It was doing something else, something far more powerful, something that could change everything for her species. She had been saved, but she had no idea what this drink would mean for her people, or for the humans who had unknowingly given her the key to her survival. The journey was only just beginning. Zira sat up slowly, her head spinning as she tried to process what had just happened. The human who had helped her was still standing nearby, his eyes wide with a mixture of concern and curiosity. She could feel the warmth in her body, an energy she hadn't known in days. It was as if the liquid she had drunk was more than just water. It had somehow brought her back from the brink of death. The human moved closer, his movements cautious but gentle. "Are you feeling better?" he asked, his voice soft. Zira didn't answer at first. She was too busy taking in the strange sensation running through her. Her skin, once cracked and dry, now felt smooth and soft. Her breathing, shallow and labored from dehydration, was now steady. She could feel her heart beating stronger, her body no longer on the verge of collapse. It wasn't just the thirst that had been quenched. She felt different, more alive than she had in a long time. She began, her voice raspy from thirst and weakness. But the words caught in her throat. She didn't know what to say. Her mind raced. What had happened? What had the human given her? It wasn't like any water she had ever known. It was thick, sweet, almost syrupy. And yet it had somehow revived her. The human seemed to sense her confusion. He knelt beside her, holding out his hand. "I'm Dr. Aiden Clark," he said. "You were in bad shape. We weren't sure if you'd make it, but it looks like you're pulling through." Zira blinked, trying to focus on the human's face. His features were soft, warm, and reassuring. She noticed his clothing, a simple jumpsuit with a logo she didn't recognize. He was part of the human team that had come to Zorvathi. They had arrived only recently, sent on a mission to make contact with any surviving members of her species. But this was the first time Sarah had seen a human up close, and she felt an odd mix of curiosity and wariness. "How did you?" Sarah began, but her throat felt dry again. She reached out, hoping he would offer her more of the liquid that had helped her. Dr. Clark hesitated, but then handed her the bottle. "It's called human nectar," he said. "We use it to hydrate and energize ourselves on long missions. We didn't know it would work like this for you, but it seems to be more than just a simple drink." Zira's mind raced. Human nectar. The name didn't sound like anything her people had ever encountered. It didn't make sense. How could something so simple have such an incredible effect on her biology? The Zorvathi had always relied on a specific type of liquid to survive, and their bodies were designed to process only that unique substance. Anything else would have poisoned them, killed them even faster. But this human nectar had done the opposite. It had saved her. She drank more of the nectar, her hands trembling slightly. As the liquid slid down her throat, she felt a surge of strength and clarity. Her head cleared, and for the first time in weeks, she didn't feel like she was on the edge of death. Dr. Clark was watching her closely, studying her reaction. He was no fool. He knew something extraordinary was happening, but he couldn't explain it. "You're not like anything I've ever seen," he said quietly. "Your physiology is adapting to the nectar, not rejecting it. That's incredible." Zira finally managed to speak, her voice steadier now. "It's not possible," she said softly. Zorvathy biology is very specific. We cannot drink just anything. If this nectar is not the right compound, it should have killed me. Dr. Clark frowned. It shouldn't have worked, he admitted. But it did. I don't understand it fully yet, but it's like your body recognized it. It's like your cells are repairing themselves. Zira looked down at her hands, flexing her fingers. She could feel the strength in her body returning. Her muscles no longer ached with weakness, and her energy had soared to levels she hadn't felt in years. But as she marveled at the changes, something else began to settle in her mind. The nectar had not only saved her, but it had done something else. Something more. Wait, she said suddenly. What will happen to my people? Dr. Clark looked at her, his brow furrowed. What do you mean? Zira explained, as best as she could, about the Zorvathy people's desperate struggle to survive, how their planet's resources had been drained, how they had lost access to the specific water they needed to live, how her people were now scattered, on the verge of extinction. She spoke of the many Zorvathy who had already perished, and of those who were too weak to continue. We don't have much time, Dira said, her voice urgent. We need a solution. If this nectar works on me, could it work for my people? Dr. Clark paused, considering her words. I don't know, he said honestly. We're still trying to understand how it affects your biology. But if it can help you, then maybe it can help others too. Zira felt a spark of hope flicker inside her. Maybe, just maybe, this was the answer they had been searching for. But there was still so much they didn't know. She had no way of knowing if the nectar would work on other Zorvathy, or if it was even safe for them to consume. But in that moment, she realized something important. The humans had unknowingly given her people the chance to survive, and that made them more than just strangers in a distant land. They were now part of her future. As she looked into Dr. Clark's eyes, she knew that the path ahead would not be easy. There were questions to answer, dangers to face, and risks to take. But she also knew one thing for sure. She was not alone anymore. And maybe, just maybe, humanity had the key to saving her people. The journey was just beginning. Zira sat quietly, her thoughts swirling like a storm in her mind. She had never imagined that the humans, strangers to her species, would play such an important role in her people's survival. The moment she drank the human nectar, everything changed. Her body had been revived in ways she couldn't explain. And now, a small flicker of hope had been ignited inside her. Could this strange liquid truly save her people? Dr. Clark had left her for a short time to discuss what had happened. When he returned, he was accompanied by a few of his colleagues. They were all human scientists, dressed in simple but practical clothing, their faces marked with exhaustion from the work they had been doing. But now, their eyes held something else: curiosity, awe, and the spark of discovery. Zira, Dr. Clark said as he approached her, this is Dr. Meera Jain and Dr. Raj Patel. They're both biologists. We've been trying to understand why the nectar had such an effect on you. Zira nodded slowly, though she didn't really know what to say. She had spent her entire life learning about the Zorvathy people and their unique biology, but what had happened to her felt so far beyond her understanding. Human nectar wasn't supposed to be life-saving, not for someone like her. But now she could feel a new energy coursing through her body, and the hunger she had felt for days had faded completely. I don't understand, Zira said, her voice quieter now. Why did it work? Why is my body reacting like this? Dr. Meera Jain stepped forward, her face thoughtful, as she examined Zira closely. It's unlike anything we've seen, she said. Your cells, they're reacting to the nectar in a way that suggests it's not just hydrating you, but actively repairing and boosting your system. It's like the liquid is teaching your body how to survive. Dr. Patil added, Zorvathy biology is unlike any other species we've studied, but from what we can observe, your body is adapting to the nectar's composition. It's as though the liquid is helping your cells process nutrients and hydration in a new way. Zira listened carefully, trying to absorb everything they were saying. The idea that the nectar could be changing her on such a fundamental level was both terrifying and fascinating. Could this liquid truly hold the key to saving her species? But why is it working for me and not for others? She asked, her voice filled with uncertainty. There are so many Zorvethi who need help. Can you really replicate this for my people? Dr. Clark's face grew serious. We're not sure, he admitted. What's happened to you is extraordinary, but it's still too early to say if the nectar can be replicated for your species as a whole. We'll need to run more tests, gather more data, and figure out how your body is reacting so we can adapt it for others. But we're willing to help. We have to. Zira stared down at the ground, feeling both a surge of gratitude and a deep sense of responsibility. She had come to the human outpost thinking she was on a suicide mission, knowing that her people's extinction was inevitable. But now, there was a chance, small but real, that they could survive. And it was all thanks to the humans. How can I help? She asked, raising her gaze to meet Dr. Clark's. I have to do something. I can't just sit here while my people are dying. Dr. Clark smiled gently, his expression understanding. You've already done more than we could have imagined, Zira. But if we're going to save your people, we need your help. We need to understand more about your species, about your biology, your culture, your history. The more we know, the better we can help you. Zira nodded, a small sense of relief settling in her chest. For the first time in a long while, she felt like she wasn't alone. The humans, though strange and different, had shown her compassion and determination. They had given her the chance to save her people, and she would not waste it. We'll start with the basics, Dr. Jane said. We need to understand the environmental conditions on Zorvethi. What are the factors that cause your planet's collapse? What are the compounds your species needs to survive? With that information, we can begin to figure out how to replicate the effects of the nectar. Kazira took a deep breath, preparing herself to share the truth about her world. Zorvethi was once a paradise, she began, her voice soft but steady. Our planet was full of life. Lush forests, crystal-clear lakes, and oceans that stretched across the continents. Our people thrived, living in harmony with nature. She paused, a pang of sadness stabbing at her heart as she thought of her home, now a wasteland. But over time, we grew careless. We mined the planet for its resources, burned the forests for fuel, and polluted the air and water. Wars between our cities and factions weakened our society, and soon, our world began to wither. The oceans dried up, the forests died, and our people, well, we've been trying to survive on what little remains, but without access to the special liquid we need, it's impossible. The humans listened quietly, their faces somber as they absorbed her words. Zira felt a lump form in her throat. It was difficult to admit the mistakes of her people, but it was the truth. And if they were to find a solution, they needed to understand what had gone wrong. There are only a few places left where the liquid still exists, Zira continued, but it's not enough for all of us. That's why we're dying. Dr. Clark and the others exchanged looks. They understood now. Zorvathi's collapse hadn't been caused by some natural disaster. It had been the result of greed, war, and the careless exploitation of resources. And now, Zira's people were paying the price. We'll do everything we can, Dr. Clark said firmly. But we need more information. Together, we can find a way to save Zorvethi. Zira nodded, feeling the weight of her responsibility. She had to help them. She had to be the bridge between her people and the humans who were offering their help. It wouldn't be easy, and the road ahead was uncertain. But for the first time in years, she felt like there was a chance, a real chance, that her people could survive. And with the humans by her side, maybe, just maybe, Zorvethi could be reborn. The days following Zira's recovery were filled with intense discussions and long hours of research. Dr. Clark and his team worked tirelessly, running tests and analyzing the strange effects of the human nectar on Zira's body. Meanwhile, Zira shared what she knew about Zorvathi's past, hoping to find any clue that might help them understand what was happening to her. She felt a deep sense of responsibility now, not just for herself, but for the people she had left behind on her dying planet. Despite the optimism that had sparked when the Nectar saved her life, the truth of the situation weighed heavily on everyone. The more they learned about Xera's species, the more complex the problem seemed. The Zorvathi people were biologically different from humans in ways they hadn't fully understood before, and while the Nectar had worked wonders on Xera, it was still unclear if it could help the others. Xera spent most of her time in the human laboratory, her body still adjusting to the strange new changes the Nectar had caused. She could feel her strength growing every day, but she was also painfully aware of the distance between her and the humans around her. They were kind, yes, but they were not her people. They didn't fully understand what it meant to be Zorvathi, to have lost everything. She couldn't help but wonder if they ever truly would. One afternoon, as Xera sat in a small room by herself, staring out the window at the bleak alien landscape of Zorvathi through the glass, Dr. Clark entered. He had a thoughtful look on his face, and there was a small tablet in his hand. Xera turned to face him, her long silver hair catching the light. "We've made some progress," he said, his voice filled with cautious optimism. Xera raised an eyebrow, waiting for him to continue. "We've analyzed the composition of your blood, your cells, and we found something remarkable," he explained, stepping closer to her. "The Nectar seems to trigger a process in your cells, helping them to repair themselves at a molecular level. It's almost like your body is able to remember how to function as it once did." Xera's mind raced. She hadn't realized it until now, but she did feel different. Not just stronger, but more alive. For a moment, she had felt as though she was waking up from a long sleep. "So, what does that mean?" Xera asked, her voice calm but filled with curiosity. Dr. Clark hesitated, tapping a few buttons on the tablet. "We believe it means that your species, if we can replicate the process, could heal. But we're not sure if the Nectar can be adapted for everyone. The Zorvathi need a very specific kind of hydration, a compound that we believe might be lost to your people forever." Xera felt a wave of despair arise in her chest. The idea that only she had been saved, and that the rest of her people might never get the same chance, was almost too much to bear. How could she be the only one to survive this? "But there has to be something," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "There has to be a way to save them." Dr. Clark looked at her with sympathy. "We're trying, Xera. We're doing everything we can." She didn't know how much longer she could hold on to hope. The weight of her people's suffering was growing too heavy on her heart. She needed answers. She needed a plan. And she needed to do something about it. The following days were filled with more experiments. Dr. Mira Jane and Dr. Patel worked on isolating the active components in the human nectar that seemed to have such an incredible effect on Xera's body. They needed to understand what made it so unique, so powerful. But there was a constant fear in the air. What if they couldn't replicate the process? What if the nectar was the only solution, and there was no way to make more? Xera spent hours with the scientists, explaining what she knew about her species' biology, trying to help them understand what they might be missing. She told them about the special compound her people needed to survive, the one that had become so scarce. It was once abundant in Zorvathi's oceans, a life-sustaining substance that allowed her species to thrive. But now, those waters had evaporated, and the compound was all but gone. One evening, as the team gathered for dinner, Dr. Clark spoke up. "We've been looking through the data, and there's a pattern emerging. It's subtle, but it's there. We think the compound you need for survival might not be entirely lost. We believe there are pockets of it left in your planet's ecosystem, hidden in remote areas, deep in the planet's remaining resources. If we can find these places, we might be able to extract what's left of the compound and start synthesizing it." Xera's heart leaped in her chest. It wasn't a guarantee, but it was the first real lead they'd had. Where are these pockets? Dr. Clark glanced at the others, then back at Xira. We think there are old, untouched water reserves. They might have the compound preserved within them, but they're hard to reach. The regions are dangerous, and many have been abandoned for centuries. We'll need to send a team to find them. Xira stood up, her eyes burning with determination. I'll go with you. I know the land. I know where we might find the reserves. Please, you can't do this without me. The humans exchanged uncertain glances. They had been so focused on the science, the research, that they hadn't considered sending Xira herself. But there was something about her presence, her connection to her planet, that made her the obvious choice. If anyone could lead them to these ancient reserves, it was her. We need to be careful, Dr. Clark said cautiously. The areas are unstable, and we don't know what we'll encounter. I don't care, Xira replied fiercely. I'm not going to let my people die. Dr. Clark hesitated for a moment, but then he nodded. All right, we'll prepare a team. We'll leave as soon as we can. Xira felt a surge of purpose. This was her chance, her people's chance. The journey ahead would be dangerous, but it was the only path left, and she would walk it with the humans, side by side, as unlikely allies. Together, they might be able to save Zorvathy. The first steps toward a new future had begun. The next few days were filled with preparations. The small team of humans, along with Xira, had made a plan. They would travel deep into Zorvathy's remaining wildlands to find the ancient water reserves that might still hold the precious compound her people needed to survive. Xira could feel the weight of the mission pressing down on her. This was no ordinary trip. This was the last hope for her people. The journey would be dangerous. The untouched areas of Zorvathy were far from hospitable. Wild storms, unstable terrain, and dangerous creatures had made these regions all but abandoned for centuries. Yet there was no other choice. If they wanted to find the life-sustaining compound, they had to take this risk. Dr. Clark, Dr. Jane, and Dr. Patel were all preparing the necessary equipment, sensors, drones, and hydration supplies. Xira could see the worry on their faces. They had never been to such an unpredictable place, and even with all their technology, they didn't know what to expect. But she knew these lands well. She had once wandered them as a child, before the destruction, and though much had changed, some things remained the same. Xira had spent her last few hours in the human facility in quiet thought. She wasn't just worried about the journey ahead. She was worried about her people, scattered across the dying planet, waiting for a solution. What if they didn't find the water? What if they couldn't extract the compound? What if the humans couldn't replicate it? Every possible outcome ran through her mind, and each one seemed to lead to failure. But she couldn't afford to think that way. She had to focus on the task ahead. Her people were depending on her. At last, everything was ready. The team gathered in the main hangar, standing near a transport shuttle that would take them to their destination. Xira stood in front of them, her posture tall and resolute. The humans, though much smaller than her and unfamiliar with her world, looked to her for guidance. "Are you ready?" Dr. Clark asked, his voice steady but filled with an edge of anxiety. His face was grim, but there was something else in his eyes. Determination. They were in this together. Xira nodded. "Let's go. We don't have time to waste." The shuttle lifted off, leaving the human settlement behind. As they soared over the cracked and barren landscape of Zorvathy, Xira couldn't help but feel a deep sadness. The once thriving planet now looked like a shell of its former self. The forests had turned to dust, and the oceans had dried up, leaving only the faintest traces of what had been. But there was still beauty, hidden in the corners, in the places where life clung stubbornly to existence. The journey took hours. The shuttle flew low over the rough terrain, dodging jagged mountain ranges and vast, empty valleys. The farther they went, the more Xira could feel the weight of the world pressing down on her. But she remained calm. Her people needed her to stay strong. As they approached the first target location, a remote valley deep in the wilderness, Dr. Patel turned to Xira. We're going to land here and start scanning for any traces of water. Can you guide us from there? Zira nodded, already familiar with the landscape. I know this place, she said. It's been untouched for centuries, but there might be something here. We'll need to look carefully. The shuttle descended slowly, its engines humming as it touched down on the dry, cracked ground. The area was desolate, but Zira could feel the faint pulse of life around her, hidden under layers of dust and time. She stepped out first, her senses alert as she scanned the surroundings. The air was thick with the scent of decay, but there was still something else, something beneath the surface. She could feel it in her bones. Dr. Clark and the others followed her, each carrying equipment and scanning devices. They all looked to Zira for direction, and she led them toward the heart of the valley. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows over the land, and the wind howled through the rocky crags. It felt like the planet itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. After hours of searching, they finally found a sign, a small, hidden spring, almost completely covered by rocks and dirt. The water wasn't much, but it was enough. The sensors they carried confirmed it. This was no ordinary spring. It still contained traces of the compound Zira's people had once relied on for survival. This is it, Zira said, her voice barely above a whisper. This is what we need. Dr. Jane stepped forward, her eyes wide with excitement. This is incredible. We have to extract as much as we can. Zira knelt beside the spring, her heart racing. The water was dark and thick, but there was no mistaking the life-giving compound within it. This was the key to her people's survival. If they could bring this water back to the humans and figure out how to synthesize it, Zorvathi could be saved. But it wasn't going to be easy. Can we get enough to work with? Dr. Patil asked, looking at the small pool of water. Zira nodded. I'll help you gather it, but we'll need to be careful. There may be more hidden in other parts of the valley, but this is a start. The team worked quickly, using specialized equipment to extract the water without contaminating it. Zira watched closely, guiding them as they carefully collected the precious liquid. As the last container was sealed, she stood back, staring at the small group of humans around her. We've found it, she said softly, feeling a sense of awe wash over her. Now we have to make sure it's enough. As the sun began to set behind them, the team packed up their equipment and prepared to head back to the shuttle. The journey back would be just as dangerous. But Zira felt a new sense of hope. This was only the beginning. They had found the first signs of life on a dying planet, and now it was up to them to save it. Together, they had taken the first step toward bringing her people back from the brink. But the real work was just beginning. The warning sirens screamed across the human outpost, cutting through the tense silence. On the command center screens, the Vrink fleet emerged from hyperspace, their angular ships forming a menacing armada in Zorvathi's orbit. Commander Reynolds' jaw tightened as he turned to Dr. Clark. They're not here to negotiate, he said grimly. Zira, standing nearby, felt her stomach twist. The Nectar, their lifeline, and the hope of her people, had become the cause of this looming destruction. She clenched her fists, a strange energy coursing through her veins ever since she had consumed the potent drink. We don't have the firepower to match them, Dr. Clark said, her voice heavy with concern. We'll need to outthink them. Zira stepped forward, her usually gentle demeanor now sharp with resolve. Then let me lead the charge. The Nectar, it's changing me. I can feel it. I'm faster, stronger. If we work together, we can push them back. Commander Reynolds frowned. You want to take on an entire Vrink army. Alone. Not alone, Zira replied. With all of you, the Zorvathi are no strangers to battle. And with human ingenuity, we have a chance. The Vrink's arrival. The Vrink ships descended like a storm, firing precise volleys that tested the outpost's defensive shields. The human engineers scrambled to keep the energy barriers intact while the Zorvathi warriors prepared for ground combat. The outpost's meager fleet of fighters took to the skies, their pilots acutely aware of the overwhelming odds. Dr. Clark coordinated efforts, her calm yet commanding voice giving orders. Focus fire on their lead ship, disrupt their formations. Meanwhile, Syrah prepared for battle. She had been a healer, not a fighter, but now her enhanced body felt primed for combat. She donned light armor scavenged from the outpost's supplies, and as she flexed her fingers, she marveled at the strength coursing through her. "Stay close to me," she told the group of Zorvathi warriors who had gathered to fight. "And trust the humans. They fight with the heart of 1,000 warriors." The ground assault. The Vrenk forces landed, deploying towering mechs and waves of soldiers armed with plasma rifles. The outpost trembled under the sheer force of their attack. Syrah led the charge to meet them, her movements a blur as she darted between cover, disarming Vrenk soldiers with almost supernatural precision. The Zorvathi warriors followed her lead, emboldened by her strength. The humans, despite their limited numbers, fought with calculated ferocity, their improvised strategies catching the Vrenk off guard. Commander Reynolds led a squad to flank the enemy, using the terrain to their advantage. Syrah tore through enemy lines, her enhanced senses giving her an edge in the chaos. She faced a towering Vrenk mech, its glowing eyes locked on her. As it fired a beam of searing energy, she leaped to the side, her reflexes impossibly fast. Grabbing a discarded weapon, she aimed at the mech's joints and fired, disabling its mobility. The turning point. In the command center, Dr. Clark monitored the battlefield. The humans were holding their ground, but barely. The outpost's defenses wouldn't last much longer against the Vrenk's relentless assault. "Commander, we need to buy more time," she said. "If we can draw their flagship into the atmosphere, we might be able to take it down with the outpost's main cannon." Reynolds nodded. "It's risky, but it's our best shot." Syrah, overhearing the plan through her comm device, made a decision. She broke away from the front lines and sprinted toward the outpost, her enhanced speed allowing her to evade enemy fire. Bursting into the command center, she said, "I'll draw the flagship closer. They want the Nectar. Let them think I'm surrendering it." Dr. Clark hesitated, recognizing the danger in Syrah's proposal. "You'd be walking into their hands." Syrah smiled, her eyes fierce. "Sometimes, the only way to win is to make them think they've already won." A bold gamble. Syrah transmitted a message to the Vrenk flagship, holding up a vial of the Nectar for them to see. "If you want it, come and claim it," she said, her voice defiant. The Vrenk commander, a cold and calculating figure, took the bait. The flagship descended, its weapon systems locked onto Syrah's position. At the same time, Dr. Clark and her team calibrated the main cannon, its energy reserves pushed to the limit. The humans and Zorvathi fought desperately to keep the Vrenk ground forces at bay, buying precious moments for the plan to unfold. As the flagship hovered low in the atmosphere, Syrah stood her ground, the vial still in hand. At the last second, she threw it high into the air, and the flagship's sensors tracked its trajectory. "Now," Dr. Clark shouted. The outpost's main cannon fired, a blinding beam of energy striking the flagship. The vessel shuddered under the impact, its engines erupting in flames. The resulting explosion lit up the battlefield, sending shockwaves that knocked friend and foe alike to the ground. Victory at a cost. With their flagship destroyed, the remaining Vrenk forces faltered. The humans and Zorvathi seized the opportunity, driving them back. Syrah, bruised but unbroken, returned to the front lines to rally her people. As the dust settled, the outpost stood battered but victorious. The surviving Vrenk retreated, their fleet disappearing into hyperspace. Syrah approached Dr. Clark and Commander Reynolds, her face a mixture of exhaustion and relief. "We did it," she said, her voice soft. Dr. Clark placed a hand on her shoulder. "No, you did it. Your courage inspired us all." Commander Reynolds added, "But this isn't over. The Vrenk will return, and we need to be ready." Syrah nodded, her gaze resolute. Then we'll be ready. Together. The battlefield was eerily silent in the aftermath of the Franks' retreat. Smoke curled into the air from the wreckage of ships and mechs scattered across the outpost's perimeter. The humans and Zorvathi, battered and weary, moved among the debris, tending to the wounded and honoring the fallen. Dr. Clark stood with Commander Reynolds at the edge of the outpost, her eyes scanning the horizon. The victory was undeniable, but the cost weighed heavily on her. "How many did we lose?" she asked quietly. Reynolds sighed, his voice rough. "Too many, but without the alliance, it would have been all of us." Nearby, Shira knelt beside a group of Zorvathi warriors, her hands glowing faintly as she administered what healing she could. The nectar within her had awakened abilities she hadn't fully understood before the battle. Now she used it to save as many lives as possible. As she stood, her gaze fell on Dr. Clark. The two women exchanged a look, a silent acknowledgement of their shared struggle. Zira approached, exhaustion evident in her every step, but her resolve burned brightly. "Dr. Clark," she began, her voice steady despite her weariness. "Because of you, my people have a future. You didn't have to help us, yet you did. Why?" Clark smiled faintly. "It's what we do. Humanity thrives on solving the impossible. And I guess we have a habit of sticking our necks out for others." Zira tilted her head, her expression softening. "A habit I hope will echo far beyond this planet. A future rekindled." In the days following the battle, the humans and Zorvathi worked together to rebuild. Engineers from both species repaired the outpost's defenses, while Zorvathi scientists studied the nectar under Dr. Clark's guidance. The breakthrough came sooner than anyone expected. With the nectar's properties fully mapped, the humans provided insights into replicating its effects in a sustainable way. For the Zorvathi, it was nothing short of a miracle. In a ceremony held in the outpost's central hall, Zira stood before her people and the human delegation. The Zorvathi leader, who had arrived in the wake of the Franks' defeat, stepped forward to address the assembly. "Today, we stand not as two species, but as one united force," the leader declared. "The humans have shown us what it means to fight for life, not out of conquest, but out of compassion. For this, we owe them a debt that can never be repaid." The crowd erupted in cheers, their voices echoing with newfound hope. Zira turned to Dr. Clark, her voice quiet amidst the noise. "You've given my people more than just survival. You've given us a reason to believe again." Clark shook her head. "It wasn't just me. You inspired us, Zira. You prove that the Zorvathi are worth fighting for." Parting ways. As the humans prepared to return to Earth, Zira faced a bittersweet moment. She had grown close to her human allies, especially Dr. Clark. Their friendship had been forged in fire, and the bond they shared felt unbreakable. "You'll come back, won't you?" Zira asked as Clark loaded supplies onto a shuttle. Clark chuckled. "You'll have a hard time keeping me away. There's still so much to learn about the nectar, and about your people." Zira smiled, her golden eyes shimmering with gratitude. "Then this isn't goodbye. It's just the beginning." The shuttle's engines roared to life, and Zira watched as it ascended into the sky, her heart heavy but full of hope. Humanity's legacy. Back aboard their ship, Dr. Clark stood at a viewport, gazing at Zorvathi below. Commander Reynolds joined her, his expression unusually reflective. "You think they'll make it?" he asked. Clark nodded. "They've got the strength. And now, they have the knowledge. The Zorvathi will thrive." Reynolds smirked. "And what about us? Do you think the galaxy will be ready for humanity's next move?" Clark's smile was faint but confident. "We've proven ourselves here. Not through power or conquest, but by showing what we're capable of when we work together. That's our legacy, our ingenuity, resilience, and compassion. And I think the galaxy is just starting to see what we're made of." As the ship's engines powered up, carrying them toward the stars, Syrah stood on the surface below, watching until the humans disappeared from view. The future remained uncertain, but one thing was clear. Humanity's legacy, now intertwined with the survival of the Zorvathi, would echo across the galaxy for centuries to come.